Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak to you. I won't go further with introductions because it's limited time, so we'll get straight into it. Quick crash course. If you're not familiar with atolls, that's an atoll. That particular atoll is a single feature, and on that atoll it has some 40 islands. So keep that in mind in terms of the distinction between an atoll island and an atoll. As is mostly the case, the human communities that have been sustained on these islands, in many cases 1,000 to 1,500 years, sometimes longer, usually occupy the largest of those islands because that's where the resources are. And whilst I'm saying it's the larger island, I've just done a scale comparison with the bay right next to the conference centre where we're sitting. And just to give you an idea of the scales that we're talking about. Okay, so that entire island could fit in the bay that's right next to us, which you probably saw when you were walking for lunch. When we talk about atolls, given you're all interested in sea level rise, you'll all understand that atolls are widely seen as some of the most vulnerable locations on the planet to sea level rise. And you may have heard of countries like Tuvalu and the other atoll nations you can see listed there. The fifth one is the Maldives in the Indian Ocean, which I won't really speak about today. I'll concentrate mostly in the Pacific. But it's important to note that whilst we have 4 atoll countries, so they only have atoll islands and therefore consider the limitations of adaptation, we have atolls spread across the entire region. And French Polynesia, for example, 80 atoll islands and 80 atolls and thousands of islands. So an awful lot to deal with, spread over huge areas. Again, given you're involved in sea level rise and impacts, you may have cottoned on to the fact that there's ongoing discussion about the relative vulnerabilities or resilience of atolls. And it's really typified by those 2 papers. You can see the titles. They almost directly contradict each other, published within 2 years of each other in the same journal. And one is suggesting the atolls are all going to be in terrible trouble in the next 30 years. The other one's kind of suggesting, hey, don't worry, they're growing vertically. Plainly, the devil's in the detail here. But those kind of messages do get transported to policymakers. They confuse practitioners, and it takes an awful lot of time for people like me to explain the context of that sort of thing. Another part of the confusion is that atolls are a really special case in terms of the resolution of the data that we require to understand the vulnerability. And what we're seeing is that there's sort of a proliferation of this more sort of global or regional modelling processes looking at inundation risk. And if it's using substandard data, and that's about 90% of the islands out there, you're going to see things like that little table that says Tuvalu's mean elevation of land using the shuttle radar topography mission data is 9.2 metres. The real data, LiDAR, is 1.55 metres, nearly an order of magnitude difference. You can't tell me that you can understand vulnerability and that you can plan adaptation when your data is that bad. And remember, the bad data represents the vast majority of the islands. There's very few places we have adequate data. And as I said, there's a proliferation of various online, map portal type systems that are allowing us to look at vulnerability across islands. And you can see there a 10 centimetre rise in sea level is saying that that entire island is being flooded. Again, a little bit of a lesson, I guess, in terms of understanding vulnerability in these islands, and it gets back to why we're seeing these mixed messages. That islands can be seen, or atoll islands can be seen to having sort of 2 main landforms. The external or the perimeter shoreline systems, which are dynamic and indeed can respond vertically to sea level rise, as that paper said. And then the internal areas of the island, which are stable, and we know of no mechanism where they can respond vertically at this time. Indeed, it would kind of be counterintuitive, given we need the stability for soils, for fresh groundwater, etc. And then there's the more important question, which is very poorly understood at the moment, that the shorelines protect those internal high-value areas of the island. The shorelines are completely dependent on living reef systems around them for protection from waves, transport of material to the shore, and for the production of the material. And we understand that those reefs are affected by sea level rise, but plainly they're affected by sea surface temperature and acidification as well. So if we see change in the function, the composition, etc. of those reefs, we can expect to see very rapid change in shorelines too. And that's just showing you very composition of the shores, etc. And the unsung hero, calcareous algae, which kind of hold everything together. So, even where we have shorelines that are responsive, and we potentially are seeing an island remain stable over time, and this is a small island in Tonga, so there's 1968, 1981, 1990, and then suddenly in 2002 we get this big gash in the top right-hand corner there. And what we can see there is a comparison of 1990 and 2018. And what's happened is, despite the apparent shoreline resilience, and no, I would say, significant change in the area of that island, it's reached the tipping point where part of the island is so low, it has transitioned to intertidal. So it's gone from an entirely freshwater dominated system, complex vegetation and soils, to now marine dominated, and it's becoming a mangrove swamp. That wouldn't be so bad if it were not happening on islands where we have large human communities, but it is, and this is Funafuti, capital of Tuvalu, where we have half a national population, and they're dealing with exactly the same issue. On Funafuti, you saw the modelling that showed nearly the whole island disappearing from 10 centimetres of sea level rise. Look, that again wouldn't be so bad, but we know there's 30 centimetres of variability just in ENSO swings in sea level, so why 10 centimetres would inundate the entire island, I've got no idea. But using LiDAR that we now have, very high resolution LiDAR, we can actually bring some accuracy to our understanding of the relationship between land height and sea level. That's plus 4 metres, and you've got about 30% of the land area, sorry, plus 0.4 metres. You've got about 30% of the land area remaining above the high tide level, and that's plus 1 metre, and you're down to less than 10% at that stage. So the issues are urgent for this community, and they are working with the United Nations Development Programme to implement, at this stage, only 7.3 hectares of reclaimed land that will be safe beyond the year 2100. And that is part of a much larger plan. So this little cartoon explains the reclamation in side view. We could just put people on that reclamation and keep them safe, but we still have a lot of people that live in low-lying flood areas. So it's part of a staged approach where we hope to move people out of the most dangerous areas of the island and do a staged reclamation approach that turns the island into a safer location for long-term settlement over time. And that's a small concept picture there. That's just a screenshot of a video that shows a much more ambitious reclamation plan on Funafuti. And that's sort of the main thrust of adaptation in that particular community, and indeed the most appropriate one given the immediate threat. One of the things I was asked to do was try to put down a few points of research needs. I won't read through them all. You can see them, you can read. And I think I'm nearly up on my time. If there's any questions I can answer.
Thank you very much for that presentation, a really sobering presentation about the current impacts of sea level rise. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, there's one question over there, for Matt.
Miguel Esteban from Waseda University. I'm a coastal engineer, so the usual question that people ask in this case is, where is the sun coming from for this? I mean, it's very... Is it going to come from the lagoon, I guess, or offshore, or? Yeah, offshore is not really a possibility with dredging technology as it stands today, but the lagoon basin is where it would come from. And the lagoon basin is exactly that, a basin full of sediment, so it's a very good way to get this kind of material.
Thank you. Question over there on table 9.
Thank you for that talk. That was really wonderful and sobering, as Ben says. So this seems like a really ambitious engineering project. What happens with salinity of the water table? And, you know, if it's a low-lying island already, where are they going to get their water from if you're building on top of that?
Sure. Well, in that particular example, it's a very broad question, and I could probably bore you all to death with answers. But in that particular island, they have not had a feasible groundwater supply for the last 50 years. It was completely destroyed during World War II and has never come back. So they are almost entirely dependent on rainfall catchments and desalination already. But just to say, incorporated into that ambitious reclamation plan is some really exciting development work around improving water supply by using things like the runway as a water catchment and reservoir.
I think we have one more question because your talk was so interesting. Question, table 11.
Hello, I'm Jahir from Bangladesh. You have shown one adaptation measure as